Let's start talking about the different types of beer. You know, I get very annoyed when people say, they talk about beers and lagers. Beer is the umbrella term, and underneath beer we can have ales, we can have lagers, and what I like to call other types of product as well. In the next two classes after this, I'm going to talk about ales, and then I'm going to talk about lagers in more detail. But let's look generally at beer styles now. So ales are those products made with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and lagers, Saccharomyces pastorianus, as we have seen. Top fermenting yeast, ale yeast, bottom fermenting yeast, lager yeast. Now with modern fermenters, these big cylindrical vessels, all the yeast tends to go south. So the differentiation between top and bottom is not quite so meaningful these days. One thing we can say is that the ale yeasts are happier at higher temperatures than lager yeasts. So the ales tend to be fermented at temperatures as high as 80 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas the lagers tend to be fermented at lower temperatures, up to about 59, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And the word lager means to store, and that refers to the fact that still, when people make lagers, many of those brewers have prolonged maturation, lagering of the product. So it's a slower process when you're making a lager. And the other difference you sometimes see in ales and lagers is the way in which they are hopped. Now, as we have seen, most of the hops get put into the boiling stage. But if you want to get some aroma and some of those oils to survive, you've really got to add the hops somewhat later in the process. Now, in the production of the famous Pilsner beers, there's a process called late hopping. And this is where some of the hops are added late in the boil, or even in the whirlpool, the hot wort stand. And that allows some of the oils to survive, and then the yeast transforms some of them, and you get a subtle hop character. We call it late hop character. If you want to get a really intense hop aroma, then the hops are added, or some of the hops are added, right at the end of the process to the finished beer, and that is called dry hopping. So most of the hops are added into the kettle to boil, so you extract the bitterness, but you add hops right at the end to get that intense hop aroma that is associated with many ales like the IPAs in North America. So as I said, we'll talk about the different types of ales and lagers in subsequent classes. But let's talk about those beers now that are a little bit different. And let's start by talking about a beer style called Lambic. This is a very famous Belgian style of product. Now, I jokingly say that this beer style is made in breweries that never get cleaned. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but these types of beers are all about different types of microorganism. When the wort is cooled, instead of using the Paraflow system that most brewers use, the wort is cooled in a vessel right at the top of the brewery called a cool ship. So this boiled wort is pumped up to this vessel right at the top and is allowed to cool slowly. And of course, steam comes off and it's got to go somewhere, so it goes through holes in the roof. And who knows what's coming in the other direction through those holes. So it's no surprise there are many different types of yeasts and fungi and bacteria. None of them will kill you, all very wholesome, but introducing all sorts of interesting flavors to this type of beer. Flavors like barnyard, flavors like really intensely sour. So we have these types of sour beers. So Lambic is a very, very sour product. Now, if you have an old Lambic mixed with a new Lambic packaged in a bottle, then you have a product style called Gueuze. So many people love these and many people don't. And that's okay. You have the beer that you like, and the best beer is the one that you like, and it doesn't have to be one necessarily that I like. Now, some people add fruit to this type of beer. If you use cherries, you produce a beer style called Kriek. Raspberries, framboise. Peaches, pêche. Apples, pombe. And blackcurrants, cassis. So there are all sorts of interesting flavors that you can get, and some of the flavor, plus perhaps a little bit extra sugar, can overcome some of that sourness in the production of this type of beer. So wonderful diversity of products, actually marvelous with cheese. And we'll talk about beer and food in a later class. Now, there are all sorts of different classifications of beer. One of my favorites from way back, from when I was a sports person, was shandy. Shandy is where you have a half a pint of ale mixed with a half a pint of lemonade. And I'm not talking sort of the crushed lemons, I'm talking about lemon-flavored soda. And then you get a very refreshing product, lower alcohol, rehydrating, quite delicious. The Germans call it Radler, the French call it Panaché, but a very refreshing product. And you can actually buy it pre-mixed, and there are brands of shandy you can buy. But in terms of other products that are produced in the brewery, various ingredients might be used for these types of beer. There's a long-standing tradition to put oysters into beer. And holding beer on top of oyster shells. There are chocolate-flavored beers. Now, we talked about chocolate malt, and some of the chocolate-flavored beers contain chocolate malt and maybe things like cocoa nibs and so on. But there is at least one beer I know that contains chocolate essence and really does taste like a bar of chocolate in a glass. And if you like it, that's great. Coriander finds its way into certain types of beer. Chili. I remember being given a chili beer once, and I've never had any Indian meal anywhere near as spicy as that. And the list goes on. There's probably no limit to what people want to use. A lot of interest these days in barrel aging and the extraction of flavor from the barrels, and perhaps also the trapping of flavors on the inside of the barrel. There was a beer made a number of years ago that was colorless. It was a lager-style beer in North America, and they thought it would be a really good idea to take all the color out of it and call it clear beer. It wasn't such a good idea, and people didn't buy it. But as I say, there's a lot of people in brewing companies that are trying to be ingenious and trying to come up with all sorts of things. Different angles. Look at me, I'm doing things differently. And some of these are more interesting than others, and some better sounding than others. I was once accused of being a Luddite because I said, you know, there's a lot to be done with malt, hops, yeast, and water. But people are interested in diversifying. One of the interesting categories is something brewers call malternatives. And these are products that are basically beers, but you never know that it were a beer unless you were told so. These are some people call them alco-pops. They're fruit-flavored drinks or other types of flavors as well. And they are beers because they are classified for taxation reasons as beer. What the brewer does is make a very bland beer and then maybe strip out all the color and add flavors to them. There's a very famous brand that has got a vodka name to it. If they made these products using the vodka, they'd be taxed as spirits. But because they are made from beers, they are taxed as beers. And the brewers call them malternatives. There's a lot of interest these days, for example, in alcoholic seltzers. Alcoholic seltzers, water white, it's a beer because it's made from a bland beer and then decolorized. So people are diversifying in these ways. In Japan, there's something called happoshu. Happoshu is a product made out of any grist, and the grist is the grain, if you like, and the cereals, the adjuncts that you use for the brew. If there is less than 25% malt in that grist, the taxation rate is much less than if there is, say, 80% or 100% malt. Therefore, they are much cheaper. Because tax is a very significant contributor to the cost of any beer in the world. So they use a lot of corn and rice and sugars and so on, and they're called happoshu. They can't call them beer but they're packaged like beers. They look like beers. They're right next to the beers in the supermarket, and therefore, because of the price advantage, that is what is bought. There is a third category, and these are products that contain no malt whatsoever. They're made out of things like pea starch and soybeans. They make me appreciate regular beer all the more, but because they have got no malt in, the tax is even less, and therefore the products are so much cheaper. So tax is a major driving force in new product development across the world. Now, there are all sorts of other ideas that people have for making beer. Now, again, a lot of it is marketing driven. Now, one category that sprung into life a number of years ago was ice beer. There was a brewing company up in Canada, and they were sitting around having a meeting and saying, we need a new concept. And so somebody said, well, how about ice? Because people in Canada know all about ice. They take the beer, the bottle of beer, put it in the snow, and the first thing to freeze out is pure water. So you can decant off a somewhat more alcoholic solution. So somebody said, what a great idea, let's call it ice beer. And so in the process, after fermentation and clarification, what they used to do is to put the beer through a machine which started to make ice crystals. And then they got rid of those and packaged the product and called it ice. Not so prevalent these days, but there were lots of companies then who were making ice beers, and a lot of lawsuits about protecting the name and so on and so forth. Dry beer. Dry beer was never heard of until a few years ago. And then a company in Japan decided that they were going to come up with a new concept. People in the world of wine knew all about dry, lower levels of residual carbohydrate, sugar. And so this concept of dry beer, allied to wonderful packaging, produced a beer that rose to be one of the top-selling brands of beer in the world very, very rapidly. Dry beer. The biggest style of beer in terms of sales in the United States is light beer. It's something like 6 or 7 out of the top 10 beers in the USA are light beers. And these are beers that contain fewer calories. Now, there are various ways to make a light beer. One is just basically to add a bit more water. Another way to do it is to play around with the mashing to make the carbohydrates more fermentable, and therefore you get rid of them more. Another way is to actually use extra enzymes that break all of the starch down. In a regular brewing process, about 80% of the starch is converted into fermentable sugars, leaving about 20% of the partially broken down starch left behind. Brewers call it dextrins. So that's left behind in the beer. So you can actually add an extra enzyme to the fermentation to allow all of that starch to be converted into alcohol. Now, the main source of calories in any beer is alcohol. So if you produce more alcohol, which you do if you have this extra breakdown of the starch, that's not good for calories. So what you have to do with these beers is to thin them out right at the end, lower the alcohol content by adding water. And this is likely the reason why these beers do tend to taste a little bit thinner than, should we say, regular beers. But light beers are consumed in substantial quantities in the United States, presumably because everybody is so health conscious. Draft. The word draft in the world of brewing means two things. Obviously, it means beer on tap, draft beer. But also, if you have a small pack, a bottle or a can, and it's labeled draft, that means it's not being pasteurized. Now, not everybody pasteurizes beer by any means, okay? But a lot of people do. But draft beer, if you see the word draft on a small pack, that indicates that that beer has, instead of being pasteurized, it's been filtered to remove any residual microorganisms. So that's draft. And again, it's a concept that took off a number of years ago in the United States. Now, most beers are relatively modest in alcohol. We'll talk about the alcohol content in different countries in a later class. but it's going to be around the 4 to 5% mark in terms of alcohol by volume, ABV, in most parts of the world. But there are a lot of beers these days which are coming into the marketplace which have got very, very high alcohol content. And I like to say there was a war going on for who can come up with the most alcoholic beer. And this war started in Boston with a beer that was 25.5% alcohol by volume, 25.5. And then this challenge went to Europe. And there's a brewing company in Germany that came out with a product of 31% alcohol by volume, 31%. And the only way to do that is by this ice brewing technology. German brewers have known about ice brewing, EIS brewing, for many years. So you take the beer, freeze it, freeze out water and concentrate it. Over to Scotland, and a company near Aberdeen came out with a product, and let's name it, it's called Tactical Nuclear Penguin. Tactical to attack the Germans, nuclear because it was 32% alcohol, and penguin because penguins live near ice. Back to Germany, where they came out with a product of 40% and thought they had won it. Back to Scotland, 41% alcohol by volume, and a product called Sink the Bismarck. And then they came out with a product of 55% alcohol by volume, and this beer is inserted into stuffed animals. So it's very much a gimmick. It's, hey, look at us, what we're doing. It's outrageous. It's a sales and marketing technique. But they've had their nose pushed out these days, and there's a product now of 67% alcohol, which I couldn't afford to buy. At the other extreme, we have non and low alcohol products. And there's a lot of interest in these. People have been making non-alcoholic beer for a long time. I used to work for a brewing company in the UK, and we made an alcohol-free beer. In fact, so alcohol-free, we used to sell it in Saudi Arabia. And the way we used to do it was to take the regular beer and strip off the alcohol. You draw a vacuum, fairly low temperature, but you drive off the alcohol. The problem is you drive off a lot of the aroma and the flavor as well. And that you have got to adjust downstream. And that's where the secrets are in terms of trying to adjust that flavor. I'm not convinced anybody has taken that approach successfully to make a great beer that way. There are other ways of doing it. You can take the wort and just show the yeast to it and then get rid of the yeast straight away. You can't make a non-alcohol product there, but you can make a fairly low alcohol product. Or what some brewers do is when they extract the malt in the mashing, they use quite a high temperature. High enough to solubilize, extract the starch, but too high for the enzymes to break it down to produce much in the way of fermentable sugar. And again, you can make a low alcohol product this way. The alternative is to take a regular beer and a de-alcoholized beer and blend them together. And that can give you interesting products of lower alcohol content. There is a big market, I think, for the lower alcohol range. Probably somewhat less of a market for the really, really high alcohol products.